Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Weekend Bible Study. This is Richard Crow filling in for Ron Dart. This is episode 17 in the Deuteronomy series, and we're recording here in Sugar Land, Texas. Last episode we finished with chapter 30 in the book of Deuteronomy, and this week we'll pick up in chapter 31. But before I do that, we do have a couple of questions. Our first question comes from Gladys Valdez, who writes from Puerto Rico. She says, I have a question regarding Deuteronomy 25, verse 11, about a woman seizing the genitals of a man attacking her husband. Mr. Crow had said it was a modesty issue, and that seems fine, but I was wondering if it can also be that God is concerned about the possibility of endangering the man's prospects of procreating children. The verses that precede that have to do with the marriage duty of a man to his sister-in-law if his brother dies. It seems God's concern revolves around people having descendants to carry on their name. Well, Gladys, thank you very much for your question, and we're glad that you're listening there in Puerto Rico. You make a very interesting point, and your observation may very well be correct. I still tend to lean, in my own studies, I think I lean toward the explanation that this was primarily a modesty issue. In the context here, we have two men who are striving, fighting. Presumably they have voluntarily submitted to combat here. It's not a situation where someone's been, say, ambushed or something like that. And taken literally, the prohibition is against seizing or grabbing the genital area of one of the combatants. And given the dress of the day, something like that would have necessitated a degree of immodesty that I suppose would have been inappropriate. But more importantly, if we take literally the prohibition, for example, it doesn't prohibit striking that area, or for that matter, taking other defensive actions, such as striking other parts of the body, which could, for instance, have resulted in death. And striking that area or striking other areas that result in death certainly also would have prohibited procreation if the person is deceased, obviously. Gladys, your question prompted me to think about this in another way, which is one of the reasons it's so good to have questions. It helps elicit thoughts and discussion and makes us all think in different new ways. But as I rethought this, I also see a sense in this verse, Deuteronomy 25:11, that when you are acting in self-defense or in defense of others, to be specific in this case, it's only appropriate to use the degree of force that is reasonably necessary, especially in the context. Remember that in this case we have two men who have gotten into a fight. It's not a situation where someone has been ambushed. And in that circumstance, it would be inappropriate for the wife to fight dirty, so to speak. I see that undertone here. In any respect, I still lean toward the explanation that this was primarily a modesty issue, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that God doesn't appear to prohibit other types of self-defense, such as striking that area or striking other parts of the body that could have caused much more severe injury, and even death, which obviously would have prevented someone from procreating at that point. One last thought about this. Deuteronomy 25 and verse 11 is an example of case law. It appears that this was a circumstance that actually occurred, or something like this that occurred, and Moses is addressing a particular set of circumstances. I don't believe this was a widespread problem in Israel. I suspect it was just something that came up, and so Moses addressed it. But because it's case law, we have to remember that there was a set of facts. When you read a case that judges write in modern times, the cases always begin with an explanation of the facts. So we know the context, we know the background. We don't know that here. We have to sort of extrapolate and make some guesses. So whatever we're saying about this is conjecture. We have to be modest in understanding that we really don't know. So Gladys, with that being said, your point may well be correct. But as I mentioned, I lean toward the explanation I provided earlier. Our second question comes from Eric Anderson. Eric doesn't disclose where he's from, although presumably somewhere in the United States based on the question. He writes, enjoying the studies on Deuteronomy. Appreciate your lawyer's perspective. Yes, as long as I'm not billing you for the time, I'm sure you do. That's my parenthetical. I have wanted to ask a question, he writes, and not sure how to frame it. Since you refer several times to our founding documents, the Constitution, etc., I wonder if you might have anything to say about natural law, how the concept informed our founding fathers, and whether natural law might be best deduced from biblical law. My own understanding of the term natural law is a little fuzzy, but the words get thrown around occasionally, and I don't know what the Christian's perspective should be on the concept. Any thoughts would be welcome. Well, Eric, that is a very interesting question, and I thought one of the most interesting aspects of your question was the comment whether natural law might be best deduced from biblical law. But I think, as you point out, the problem here, at least in my own studies, is to arrive at an agreed-upon definition of natural law. Black's Law Dictionary has a very lengthy explanation of or definition, I should say, of natural law. I'll just read part of it. Quote, "These express, necessary, and obligatory rules of human conduct, which have been established by the author of human nature as essential to the divine purposes in the universe, and that have been promulgated by God solely through human reason." That definition seems to be saying that God, the author of human nature, has set about divine rules that can be deduced purely through reason, that God has given us what we need to understand certain intrinsic, inherently important laws, those being natural law. To the extent we accept that as the definition of natural law, which we can't really do, there's a whole other set of definitions offered, for instance, in Black's Law Dictionary. And that's just one source. We could go to other sources and probably come up with other definitions. But if we accept the definition that I just read, I suppose I would agree that the Bible would be the best place to help deduce natural law, because the Bible is the Creator's revelation to man. Eric, you mentioned my lawyer's perspective, and one of the things I've learned as a practicing attorney is that it's often very difficult to arrive upon agreement with respect to what words mean. And natural law would certainly fall into that category. I don't see any clear consensus on what that means. So again, if we accept the definition I gave, we can reach a certain conclusion. If we accept someone else's definition, the conclusion obviously would be different. Let me give you an example. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. This book was written by Kevin Gutzman, who is a lawyer and also has a Ph.D. in history. And he is currently, well, at least at the time he wrote this book, he was a history professor at Western Connecticut State University. And he writes a little bit about the conflict here that in this passage I'll read, the conflict between President Jefferson and John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during most of President Jefferson's time in office. And there was a lot of tension between the two of them. And let me just read about it. Jefferson and Marshall were separated by differences over the very nature of law. For Jefferson, law was the framework of rules by which the people agreed to be governed. A judge's sole role was simply to apply the clear meaning and original understanding of the Constitution or other legal document. Dr. Gutzman continues, but Marshall and his allies, like Joseph Story, believed that law required judges who could see beyond the written law to the, quote, natural law, close quote, that was superior to it. Jefferson's vision was Republican. Marshall's was aristocratic or clerical. As Justice Iredell pointed out in Calder v. Bull, no two men agreed about the particulars of the natural law. Instead, they tended to use natural law as a justification for legislating their own policy preferences. It is unsurprising, then, that Marshall's and Story's natural law always led to pro-federalist outcome. Perhaps surprisingly, Marshall's vision of judging, the Federalist vision, continues to dominate lawyers and judges' thinking about the judicial role even today. There's a lot there we could discuss, but what is most salient in this discussion is that this scholar is conceding that even among the founding fathers, people like Jefferson and Marshall, there was no clear agreement on what natural law even meant. So, Eric, in short, I think that's our problem. If we want to make generalizations, we've got to make sure all the definitions are agreed to. But very good, very interesting question, good discussion. Write back if you have any further thoughts on it, and we could continue this discussion at a later time. Well, thanks again, Gladys and Eric, for your great questions. Please don't hesitate to send questions or comments. That really helps spice up the discussion and helps me to think and hopefully helps others as well. If you do have questions, you can write those to Richard Crow at borntowin.net. That's Richard Crow, all one word. Crow is spelled C-R-O-W, at borntowin.net. I look forward to hearing from you. As we turn our sights back to Deuteronomy, Remember that last episode, Moses made his final appeal to the nation to ratify the covenant. It was a very emotional appeal, culminating in the statement in Deuteronomy 30:19 to choose life, one of the most recognized phrases in the Bible. In the concluding 4 chapters that we're going to begin today, the overriding theme is the transfer of leadership from Moses to Joshua. Remember that Moses is now an old man who knows he will not be able to enter the promised land. But having fought a good fight and having lived a life well, he's now passing the torch on to the next generation. As you can imagine, it must have been a bittersweet experience, and we can see that as we read through the concluding chapters of Deuteronomy, and we move toward the death of Moses, who without a doubt was one of the most interesting and important figures in history, biblical or otherwise. We'll get started after a short break. Deuteronomy chapter 31. Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. Much of what follows today in chapter 31 and also into chapter 32 is a repetition and a summary of all that has preceded. Moses is now approaching his death, and like any great prophet or teacher, and really all men as they grow older and as death approaches, they go back to the core elements, the most fundamental things. As we near death, we tend to focus on what's important and to block out the minutia. We can see that even today. As our capacity perhaps diminishes to some extent, we save our energy to focus on what's really important. And that is not entirely a bad thing. I'm reminded by a speech that was given by Jim Valvano, who was the basketball coach at North Carolina State University, and his team won the 1983 NCAA championship. And he was giving a speech in 1993 to accept an award, and at this time, Coach Valvano was dying of cancer. And he was very weak and was obviously in a lot of pain, but managed to summon the strength to give this speech. And it was a very inspiring speech. You can get on YouTube sometime and watch it. But what was funny is toward the end, it was a televised speech. There was a flashing light that was telling him it was time to sit down, that he only had 30 seconds. And his response was, hey, there's this guy flashing this light at me saying I have 30 seconds. Like, I care about that right now. I'm about to die, basically, is what he said. And the way he said it, it was actually humorous in the context. But the point was well taken. I have a limited time here. I'm going to focus on what's important, and everything else, all these distractions, I'm just going to push aside because I'm without fear here. It's time to get down to what's important. And you can just see that. I think that's largely what must be going through Moses' mind at this time as we break into this story here at the end of his life. It's also interesting to note that although Moses was older here and was obviously growing weaker, he was not necessarily literally unable to continue leading, at least for a time at this point. He's being understated here when he says he's unable to lead. The reason he's unable to lead at this particular moment is that he was not going to be permitted to enter into the promised land. This was God's decision based on Moses' earlier conduct. And how difficult this might have been to be so close, yet to be unable to cross over into the promised land. Yet Moses here is remarkably gracious. He's not full of self-pity or regret. He's humble right up to the very end. We can see in this, it's subtle, but if you look for it, you can see more evidence of what an amazing man that he was. It would have been tempting to wallow in self-pity, to whine, which is so common to our human condition, but we see none of that from Moses here at the end of his life. We'll pick up in verse 3. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. Verse 4. And the Lord will not do to them what he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, whom he destroyed along with their land. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. Verse 6. Be strong and be courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Note that in verses 1 through 6, we are reading words that are attributed to Moses. This is a quote. And Moses is instructing Joshua at the end here in verse 6 to be strong and to be courageous. And he points out that previously Israel had to fight against giants. The king of Og is described as, or King Og is described as a giant who had a bed that was 13 feet long. There would have been lots of reasons to be afraid, to be discouraged, and Moses is warning against that. He's reminding them that God would fight on their side, but he would also require them to fight for themselves and to show courage. It seems here that God does help those that help themselves. It's proper to pray for God's favor, of course, but apparently we have to do something. We have to do our part. We see that here in Moses' instructions to Joshua. God will fight with them, but they still have to show courage. They still have to pick up the sword and take action. Verse 7. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their forefathers to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Again, this time in front of all the people and Joshua, Moses repeats this idea. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. Discouragement or loss of morale is like kryptonite. It saps your strength. We're reminded of this in our own history when President Roosevelt, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, uttered these famous words that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Fear and fatigue does make cowards of us all, to paraphrase Coach Vince Lombardi. And Moses is warning against these things, telling the people, don't lose morale. Take heart. You will have a role to play here. God will be with you, but you have to take up the sword and show courage and fight against the human tendency to become discouraged as things get tough. Verse 9. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the aliens living in your towns, so that they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. A few observations about this last passage. Every 7 years during the year of release, that is the year when debts are canceled and forgiven, the law was to be read during the Feast of Tabernacles. Some commentators have noted that the public reading of treaties at periodic intervals was a common practice in the ancient world. And we could see why that might have been the case. It would have had a very practical purpose, because before the days of the printing press or mass media, things had to be passed along orally, and reading the treaty publicly would have been one of the best ways to communicate the terms of the covenant. But I think there's also a lesson here for us, and that is the importance to periodically review the basic things, to be diligent to go back to the fundamentals. We hear coaches talk about this in sports. If you want to play certain sports, that even the professionals and the college athletes who are elite have to occasionally go back and review fundamentals. The same is true for the Christian disciple or student, that from time to time we need to review the fundamentals and have those reiterated to us. And we can see that here, I think, is all that's being done here in Israel, that every so often the terms of the covenant needed to be read publicly, just to reinforce and remind the people of its importance. Verse 14. The Lord said to Moses, Now the day of your death is near. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tent of meeting, where I will commission him. So Moses and Joshua came and presented themselves at the tent of meeting. Then the Lord appeared at the tent in the pillar of a cloud, and the cloud stood over the entrance of the tent. And the Lord said to Moses, You are going to rest with your fathers, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to the foreign gods of the land that they are entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant I made with them. On that day I will become angry with them and forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they will be destroyed. Many disasters and difficulties will come upon them, and on that day they will ask, have not these disasters come upon us because our God is not with us? And I will certainly hide my face on that day because of all their wickedness in turning to other gods. Notice in the earlier part of this passage, as Joshua is having power transferred to him by Moses, that a pillar of cloud appears. Very clearly God wanted to associate a supernatural event with this occurrence. And clearly we can see why that would be, that God is revealing to the people that Joshua is to be the successor. He's helping Moses with this transfer, lest there be any doubt, just to show that God is endorsing it. But also what occurs here is perhaps even more interesting, is that God is revealing to Moses very clearly at this point that the people will in fact turn away. We read earlier in chapters 30 in particular, where Moses seemed to be almost prophesying that the people would turn away, but it wasn't clear if these events were preordained or what would actually occur. But lest there be any doubt, at this point, God is making it pretty clear that this will occur. There will be a falling away. And this would not have been a shock to Moses, but it still would have had to have been very disappointing. Moses would have had a very bittersweet relationship with the nation. He would have loved them and he had given his life for them. But on the other hand, he would have also been very discouraged by them and very frustrated by them. But finally, God reveals later in this passage that the people will eventually come to their senses. We see this theme. There will be a falling away, but there also will be a reconciliation. It's interesting because this very day as I'm giving this presentation, Governor Rick Perry has asked for a day of fasting and prayer in the state of Texas. And I know many churches, including some of the churches of God, are participating in that, which I think is a good thing. And it makes me wonder if things are bad enough that our nation may be ready to actually repent and to really make some changes. As we read throughout Deuteronomy, including this passage we just read, that we get the sense that things will get bad enough, and did in fact get bad enough, that the Israelites did repent and did change their ways, at least for a time. Could that happen today? Would it happen today? Certainly in theory, I think it would be possible. I read nothing in the Bible that would lead me to conclude that a nation today could not repent. But candidly, I wonder if things are bad enough that it's gotten to the point that people are really ready to get serious about turning from their ways and turning toward God. Only time will tell. Verse 19. Now write down for yourselves this song and teach it to the Israelites, and have them sing it, so that it may be a witness for me against them, when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, and the land I promised on oath to their forefathers, and when they eat their fill and thrive, they will turn to other gods and worship them, rejecting me and breaking my covenant. And when many disasters and difficulties come upon them, this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants. I know what they are disposed to do, even before I bring them into the land I promised them on oath. So Moses wrote down this song that day and taught it to the Israelites. The Lord gave this command to Joshua son of Nun: Be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath, and I myself will be with you. I think this is fascinating what we just read. Moses is commanded to teach the nation a song to be repeated and passed down from generation to generation. Why? Well, it's explained to us here, so that when the nation is dispersed, when the difficult times do come, when presumably they would be left without a written history, without a way to pass on the information in written form, for instance, all they might have would be a song to carry on the knowledge. We can see this today. You can remember the words to songs great gospel hymns that we heard when we were children. Those words stick with us. Interestingly, Mr. Dart, as many of you know, he could sing songs word for word that he learned many years ago. And it just goes to show you that, without a doubt, there's a part of the brain that's able to assimilate a lot of information when it's set to a tune. And it's a very effective way to pass on information. I've seen this in my own life that when I was a youngster, again, I'm going to give away my age here, that there was a very popular cartoon series called Schoolhouse Rock. And there was one song in particular where the words were set to a tune, and it was the preamble of the Constitution. And to this day, I could recite to you the preamble of the Constitution of the United States verbatim simply by humming the tune of this song. It really made an impression on my mind. And we could see how this would have been the same for Israel. This would have been a very powerful message set to words that the people would have remembered and been able to pass on. And later on today, when we get into chapter 34, we'll actually read the lyrics of the song. Verse 24. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of the law from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you, for I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you have been rebellious against the Lord while I am still alive, and with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? Assemble before me all the elders of your tribes and all your officials, so I can speak these words in the hearing and call heaven and earth to testify against you. For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt, and to turn from the way I have commanded you. In days to come disaster will fall upon you, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord and provoke him to anger by what your hands have made. Well, to the extent there was any doubt, there certainly is none now, that the nation was destined to fall away from the covenant. Most parties enter into deals with some degree of optimism that things will work out. Otherwise, they wouldn't enter into the deal. But clearly here, Moses has no optimism that this deal is going to work out, that there will be a falling away. Moses knew the deal was going to go bad. It was just a matter of time. And how disappointing this must have been to him. He had given his life, his blood for these people, and he knew that their nature was such that they would rebel at some point. Thus we understand the context of the Song of Moses, why it would have been so important that the people have this lifeline, this ability to recall what God had done for them and to understand what they needed to do to find their way back to God. And at that point, all they might have would be a song. And we'll go over that song in chapter 32 after this short break. Deuteronomy chapter 32. As you will recall before the break, we mentioned that God commanded Moses to write down this song. It's not clear, but there is the hint here that this was supernaturally delivered to Moses, both the lyric and, presumably, the music. Although, again, that's not fully clear. But can we imagine, allow our minds to think about for a moment how beautiful a song composed by God must have been, how perfect it would have been. In my own mind, I would imagine that it would have been a relatively simple tune, but yet hauntingly beautiful. One of the tunes that comes to mind is in my own life that I just think is so beautiful is the song Danny Boy. It's a very simple tune when you think about it. It's not particularly complicated, but it's perfect. Every note is just what it should be, and you hear it once and you remember it. And I suspect this song would have been just the same. Let's begin. Verse 1. Listen, O heavens, and I will speak. Hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. Let my teaching fall like rain, and my words descend like dew, like showers on new grass, like abundant rain on tender plants. At the beginning of this song, Moses is being very poetic. He's using a very powerful rhetorical device. He's saying, listen now, I'm calling on all of creation to witness that what I'm about to say is very important. I'm reminded of Mark Antony's speech in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar when he begins, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." Words like these are powerful, and they grab our attention. And Moses is trying to do exactly the same thing here. Verse 3, "I will proclaim the name of the Lord. O praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock, his works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he." Moses takes the time here at the outset of this song to proclaim, to praise the name of the Lord. And this is a theme that we see throughout the book of Deuteronomy, the importance of having reverence for the very name of God. We see this, for instance, in chapter 5, verse 11, where the third commandment against taking God's name in vain is reiterated. We see that in other places in Deuteronomy where the people were reminded not to make vows and associate those vows with the name of the Lord unless they were fully prepared and totally committed to complete those tasks. And the point is simply, don't take God's name lightly. Use the name with reverence. If you're going to meet the President of the United States or a king or a 4-star general or someone very important in our world, you would not call him or her by their first name. That would not be showing reverence to their name, their office, if you will. And it's the same principle with God, just on a much greater scale, that the name represents his office. It represents who he is, the ruler, the creator of the universe. And the respect for God must be reinforced by not using the name lightly. Verse 5, "They have acted corruptly toward him. To their shame, they are no longer his children, but a warped and crooked generation. Is this the way you repay the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? Is he not your Father, your Creator, who made you and formed you?" Verse 7, "Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, and he divided all mankind, set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance." So here in the song now, Moses is presupposing a time that Israel has been brought low, and he is inviting them to think back, to ask the older generations, the elders, what did it used to be like? Has it always been like this? And it will be important in that circumstance that the older generation helps keep the knowledge alive. The old folks, so to speak, will play an important role in the national revival. It's good to have wise old men around, something that sometimes seems to be lacking today. We need that older generation to remind us that things weren't always like this and that things can get better. And if we turn back, in this case Israel, if they turn back to God, things would get better. Something I've thought about recently, I got to know my great-grandmother, one of them, who lived to be 100 years old, and she died in 1981. So as a young man, I actually got to spend quite a bit of time with her. So when you think about that, she was born in 1881. As a young person, I was befriended by a man who, at the time I would have been about 12 or 13 years old, who used to tell me stories about how he saw Babe Ruth play baseball back in the 1920s. So think about that. Think of that connection to the older generation. And this man that I got to know, who would have been watching Babe Ruth play in the 1920s, or even my great-grandmother as a young woman, would have known people who fought, for instance, in the Civil War. And some of the people that they knew who fought in the Civil War would have perhaps known people who might have fought, or at least known people who fought in the Revolutionary War. So you can see how throughout the generations there's this connection to the past, and how critical that is that those things are shared. And you see that here in this Song of Moses, that the old people will play an important role in reminding the nation at its lowest point of their heritage, that things weren't always so, and that things could get better. Verse 10, "In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions. The Lord alone led him, no foreign god was with him. Verse 13, He made him ride on the heights of the land and fed him with the fruit of the fields. He nourished him with honey from the rock and with oil from the flinty crag, with curds and milk from herd and flock, and with fattened lambs and goats, with choice rams of Bashan, and the finest kernels of wheat. You drank the foaming blood of the grape. Verse 15, Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. Filled with food, he became heavy and sleek. He abandoned the God who made him and rejected the rock, his Savior. They made him jealous with their foreign gods and angered him with their detestable idols. They sacrificed to demons which are not God, gods that they had not known, gods that recently appeared, gods your fathers did not fear. You deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave birth. In the passage we just read, in the early part of it, Moses is rehearsing things that had not actually occurred yet, but would occur, and that being that early on during this covenant period, Israel would experience great blessings, great prosperity. Everything God promised, if they were obedient, would occur. But as verse 15 points out, eventually they would grow fat, meaning affluent. And it seems that the downfall of many nations sometimes is their success, their affluence. They get soft, they have too much time on their hands, and the nation doesn't have the same hunger for righteousness and for conquest and for the noble pursuits. And many times affluence can be, ironically, the downfall. I read a headline, or several headlines actually, just this morning before I came over to record this. And the first headline was that 31 soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. A transport helicopter was apparently shot down. We don't know all the details yet, but we do know that 31 American soldiers were killed. The other headline that jumped out at me was that our credit rating for the bond debt issued by the United States has been downgraded for the first time in our history. But just below those headlines was something that said the highest rated cable television show last week was a show called Jersey Shore, which is a reality television program about young people who are very much self-absorbed and whose lives focus on going to clubs and getting drunk and pursuing fame and all the things that are probably worst about our culture right now, frankly. And what does it say about us that in the midst of all this difficulty that we have time as a nation to focus on a program like this? And I think it simply reflects what is discussed here in Deuteronomy, that once a nation grows affluent, that if they're not careful, their moral character can begin to degenerate. And it's for a very practical reason. You have the time and the luxury to get into trouble. When you're not out pursuing, when you're not building and seeking conquest and growing as a nation, you'll tend to allow that idleness to lead to pursuits that are not helpful. Let me point out one other thing, that in verse 15 the term Jeshurun is used. That's spelled Jeshurun. And this is really just a pet name, if you will, for Israel that God would use periodically. It's derived from a root word meaning upright, straight, and just. And it describes Israel when it's on the straight and narrow path, when it has not strayed from the standards set forth by God. This term appears 4 times in the Old Testament and 3 of those times in Deuteronomy. And I would equate it to a name that's sometimes given even characters in history to describe their character, sort of like Richard the Lionhearted. The lionhearted part of that was intended to convey an aspect of his character, that he was valiant, courageous in battle. We are told that part of our inheritance from God will be to be given a new name as well. And I suspect that new name will reference some aspect of our character that makes us special, that makes us important. We see this in C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where at the end of the story, the young characters are given new names by Aslan. Aslan names the oldest son King Peter the Magnificent. The other son is King Edward the Just. the sisters, I should say, Queen Lucy the Valiant and Queen Susan the Gentle. And this is very much in line with what will happen to Christians someday when they're given a new name by God, a name that will reflect what God understands about us to be special, because who else would know better than the one who created us? And the day that we receive that new name will be a great day indeed. Verse 19. The Lord saw this and rejected them, because he was angered by his sons and daughters. I will hide my face from them, he said, and see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children who are unfaithful. They made me jealous by what is no God, and angered me with their worthless idols. I will make them envious by those who are not a people, and I will make them angry by a nation that has no understanding. For a fire has been kindled by my wrath, one that burns to the realm of death below. It will devour the earth and its harvest, and will set afire the foundations of the mountains. Verse 23. I will heap calamities upon them, and send my arrows against them. I will send wasting famine against them, consuming pestilence and deadly plague. I will send against them the fangs of wild beasts, the venom of vipers that glide in the dust. In the street the sword will make them childless. In their home terror will reign. Young men and young women will perish, infants and gray-haired men. Verse 26. And I said I would scatter them and blot them out of their memory from mankind. But I dreaded the taunt of the enemy, lest the adversary misunderstand, and say, Our hand has triumphed, the Lord has not done all this. Verse 28. They are a nation without sense. There is no discernment in them. If only they were wise and would understand this and discern what their end will be. How could one man chase 1,000, or two put 10,000 to flight, unless the rock had sold them, unless the Lord had given them up? Think of the impact this would have had on the people experiencing this. They would be, at the time these events described would be occurring, they would be rehearsing this song that they had known from their earliest memories, and it would be describing exactly what they're experiencing. It would have had to make an impact, at least on those who would have had ears to hear. And we can see how those who would have had ears to hear would have been motivated to return to God, who would have been more than willing, would have been joyful at the thought of their return. And we get a hint of that in this very passage. And it's easy to miss, because most of the passage we just read talks about the bad things that would occur once Israel rejected God's covenant. But take a look at verse 26 again. Moses is writing that as though this is being spoken by God. So God is saying, I said I would scatter them and blot out their memory from mankind. So he's saying that this destruction would be pretty thorough. But I dreaded the taunt of the enemy, lest the adversary misunderstood and say, Our hand has triumphed, the Lord has not done all this. So God is saying, but because he doesn't want the enemies, the ones who are inflicting this pain on Israel, to become arrogant, to become presumptuous, to think it was their hand that accomplished this versus God removing the hedge from Israel that allowed it to happen, it appears that God's going to cut this short. That on his own, unilaterally, he's going to mitigate to some extent the pain and the punishment that is being inflicted on Israel. And why would he do this? Well, in part because he doesn't want the enemy nations to get the wrong idea, but also in part because he loves Israel. He is a merciful God. There's a certain openness that he always has, even under the worst circumstances, to his people. All he wants them to do is come back to him to repent. And we see that hint of that here. If you look at verse 28, it continues, they are a nation. I think that they here refers to the nations that are persecuting Israel. They are a nation without sense. There is no discernment in them. If only they were wise and would understand this and discern what their end will be. Verse 30, how could one man chase 1,000 or put 10,000 to flight unless the rock had sold them up, or unless the Lord had given up on them. So it's asking a rhetorical question. How could one man chase away 1,000? Well, of course they couldn't. So how could a nation overthrow Israel? Well, they couldn't unless God had removed the hedge, had removed the blessing of the covenant. But throughout this, we still get this sense of God's desire to be merciful. He doesn't like what's about to happen, but it's necessary nonetheless. Verse 31. For their rock is not like our rock, as even our enemies concede. Their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are filled with poison, and their clusters with bitterness. Their wine is the venom of serpents, the deadly poison of cobras. Have I not kept this in reserve and sealed in my vaults? It is mine to avenge. I will repay in due time. Their foot will slip. Their day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them. A couple of interesting things about the passage we just read. In verse 31, an interesting statement is made that even the enemies of Israel will concede that the gods of their nations are not like the God of Israel. They'll remember, to some extent, the blessings and the protection, the hedge, if you will, that God placed around Israel. And when they see Israel's fall, they'll be mystified to some extent how that occurred, because they'll understand there was some difference there. I think that's an interesting point that's easy to overlook as we read through that passage. And another interesting thing to look at in verse 34. God, again speaking in the first person here in the song, says, Have I not kept this in reserve and sealed it in my vaults? And what is he talking about? He's talking about the wickedness of the nations who are persecuting Israel. Just because Israel has fallen, that doesn't mean God has turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed by these other nations. God's not pleased with this. He's kept it in his memory, if you will. Verse 35 then says, It is mine to avenge. I will repay it in due time. In my time, I'll take care of these other nations, lest they think it was their strength or their cleverness that allowed them to overtake Israel. No, these nations were simply tools, useful idiots, if you will, used by God as his instruments to punish Israel, to mete out the punishment with respect to the covenant Israel had broken. We get a sense of this in the book of Isaiah. I'll just read a short passage there. If you go to Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 through 7, it says, Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I will send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder, and to trample down like mud in the streets. So he will use the Assyrians, Isaiah is discussing here, God will, to mete out punishment on the nation of Israel. But, continue on in verse 7, But this is not what he intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy and put an end to many nations, meaning that Assyria's time will come. God is not mocked. Assyria will also reap what it has sown. And think about this for a moment. God is a God of both mercy and justice. His inherent sense of justice demands righteous judgment. So the nations that torment Israel, they don't get a free pass. But it's a necessary evil, if you will, that God will allow them for a time to be the tool that he uses to teach Israel a lesson. Verse 36. The Lord will judge his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees their strength is gone, and no one is left, slave or free. He will say, Now where are their gods, the rock they took refuge in? The gods who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up and help you. Let them give you shelter. See now that I myself am he. There is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal. And no one can deliver out of my hand. I lift my hand to heaven and declare as surely as I live forever, when I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand grasps it in judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood while my sword devours flesh. the blood of the slain and the captives and the heads of the enemy leaders. Verse 42 that we just read ends a long passage where God is being quoted. It's as if God is speaking in the first person. And it gives a lot of insight into God's mind. Because no matter how bad things get, and they will get bad, we can't soft sell that part of it, but God will still be there, ready, willing, and able to avenge Israel, to take them back, that He will make their enemies pay for what they have done. All the nation has to do is to return to God. And if you look at verse 43, now spoken from the standpoint of the people, from Moses telling them what to do, it says, "Rejoice, O nations, with His people, for He will avenge the blood of His servants, and He will take vengeance on His enemies, and make atonement for His land and His people." So no matter how far they stray, God will stand there ready to vindicate His people in due time. God is a warrior, ready to go to battle on behalf of His people. And that would have been a very comforting thought. And it would have been part of the song that the people would have been able to sing, literally, at the lowest points. And we know at least some must have been moved by this, because eventually the nation does, at least for a season, return to God. And much of the rest of the Old Testament is devoted to describing this cycle that the nation seems to get into periodically, where they are obedient, and then they regress, and then they repent. But at each turn, when they really repent, God is there for them and ready to forgive and ready to restore them, just as it's predicted in this song of Moses. There are lessons for us today. We worship this same God who stands always ready to forgive us. No matter how far we've fallen, He's ready to forgive us and to vindicate us when necessary, and to provide the greatest gift of all, that of eternal life. What an amazing offer that is, and what a comforting thought as we end this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time as we conclude the book of Deuteronomy.